Hello, welcome everyone. It's nice to see a bunch of people already logged in. We'll give the rest a couple, like 1 or 2 minutes to join, and then we'll get started. Until then, maybe if you want to pop into the chat where you're from. I think we have some people for whom it's in the afternoon right now, maybe some in the morning. So yeah, feel free to share if you want to. And then we'll get started soon. Got some more people coming here. So yes, for everyone new, welcome. We'll start in around a minute. Okay, I'll slowly get started. We still got a few people coming in, but yeah, welcome everyone to our webinar on data-driven grid decarbonization. We're gonna discuss a bunch about how to measure and reduce electricity emissions today. And my name is Leah. I'm gonna be the moderator and yeah, just guiding through this webinar a bit today. So we'll first dive into some housekeeping rules real quick. We'll have this webinar for around 60 minutes, including a quick FAQ at the end. So you'll be out here in around an hour. And if you check the bottom right corner of your screen, you can find some tabs there. This includes a little question tab where you can pop in some questions throughout the webinar. And we will go through these at the end. You can also upvote questions from other attendees and yeah, see the questions that other people ask in the webinar. We'll also have some polls throughout the webinar. You can participate in the live polls. There'll be a little pop-up and you can check the answers out in this polls tab there as well. We'll also be sharing some links that you can find down there. And at the end of the webinar, we'll also have a recording that we'll send out to everyone. So yeah, check your inbox the next couple of days. So if you missed something, you can always dive back into it. And yeah, so who do we have on stage here today? We have Olivier Corradi, the CEO and founder of Electricity Maps. And then he will share the stage together with Killian Daly from Energy Tech, Executive Director there. And I'm going to be moderating today. My name is Leah. So yeah. And the agenda for today, just super quickly before we dive into it, we'll start talking a little bit about why we're even here, why accurately measuring electricity emissions matters, and then we'll dive into the regulatory landscape and talk about granularity and why this is so important to have granular data. Then finally, we're going to dive into which signals to use for granular grid data and go through some use cases beyond the granular accounting space. And yeah, talk about what other cases there are, what things you can do with granular grid data, and what value you can unlock. So without further ado, let's get started. Ollie, you can take the stage. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Leah. Welcome, everyone. I'm hyper excited to see that many of you gathered here today. The reason why we are having this webinar is because we now live in a world where the carbon footprint of electricity varies in real time. It didn't used to be the case when we didn't have that many renewables in the grid, but now we do. And that is causing some consequences, and we need to adapt to this. So this is screenshots from the Electricity Maps app that are showcasing various examples that showcase why the carbon footprint of electricity varies in real time. This is California. You're seeing on the left-hand side the green area representing low carbon electricity during the day. On the right-hand side of the graph, you can see this this orange piece, which represents all of the solar electricity on the Californian grid which is causing the carbon intensity to be much lower. So California has a lot of solar, causes the carbon footprint of electricity to vary from hour to hour. Another example is where I'm currently located right now in Denmark, where you see the carbon intensity fluctuate as well, but for a different reason this time. If you look on the right-hand side in blue, you see the wind production in Denmark. And obviously, where there's less wind, there's a heavier reliance on imports, which changes the carbon footprint of electricity. So this change that has been happening over, the past decade or so does mean that our accounting practices need to evolve. And if they aren't evolving, that means that there are some risks that we can be going through. The press has been calling out some practices that are not yet reflecting this granular accounting. And the lack of granularity is something that is getting picked up. We have some examples here from Bloomberg and from Nature Climate Change, recently also from the Washington Post and the Financial Times. We won't be spending too much time here, but what I want to dig a little bit deeper into in order to set the stage is a problem that I think is fundamentally fascinating, which is that the tracking of the origin of electricity is a surprisingly difficult topic. The reason is that we simply cannot paint electrons coming from a wind turbine in a particular color and observe where they will end up on the electricity grid, and therefore, unambiguously assign electrons from the wind turbine to a consumer. And therefore, there are different methodologies or concepts that are coming up in order to understand where electricity comes from. We'll start with the location-based approach on the left-hand side. With the location-based approach, we're operating from a paradigm where consumers can't choose their electricity the origin of their electricity. If you have two neighboring houses, they will get exactly the same electricity, no matter what they're doing. And the issue we're having here is that if we have corporates who are capable of procuring electricity from a different place, they're not able to claim credit from the fact that they're procuring electricity from a particular wind turbine. And they are doing an action that's motivating the installation of more renewables by funding them. And that preferential treatment is not reflected in the location-based paradigm. And therefore, we have a market-based paradigm where here a consumer can buy an instrument where there's a guarantee of origin and renewable energy credit to represent the fact that they're funding a specific renewable asset. And then in return, they get to have a claim. The issue there is that typically these types of paradigm of instruments have been yearly market-based, on a yearly level, as Killian will explain a bit later. And therefore, the next evolution of this is called granular accounting. It's called 24/7. It has many names, but it is sort of a more physically representative accounting, which then incentivizes more of the flexibility that we want in the system, reflecting more the physical reality that the carbon footprint of electricity varies from 1 hour to the other. And today we will be discussing mostly, the granular accounting piece, talking about beyond location-based and yearly market-based, what can carbon accounting practices that can stand scrutiny, what do they actually look like? So if we move a step further, if you actually want to accurately measure and reduce your electricity emissions in a corporate setting, there are three pieces that you generally want to work together. The first piece is that you need to understand how much electricity you're consuming in your facilities through metering. We call that metering data. There's another piece where you need to understand these facilities that are consuming electricity at the time at which you're consuming them and at the location at which you're consuming it. Where did that electricity come from the grid? And that's the granular grid data. We're going to dive deeper. And then finally, if you're having procurement activities, buying electricity from a specific place, then you need to source also that data. And if you have the three pieces of that of the puzzle, then you are able to accurately measure your emissions. And as I mentioned before, we're going to dive into the grid side of things, the electricity you're getting. If you ignore procurement, just a piece that you're getting from the grid. And at Electricity Maps, we are providing this granular grid data now with global coverage, and you can explore it or access it in two ways. One is through an API, which is powering accounting systems, smart devices, and so on, and through an app which is used now by millions of people, that is freely accessible, where you can explore this data and build for yourself an intuition about how these carbon emissions are varying over time. But maybe first we have a poll for you, and Leah, maybe you want to introduce the poll for us.
Yes, of course. So I think everyone should get a little pop-up now. We would really like to know from you, do you use electricity grid data in your operations? And yeah, please go ahead and answer. And yeah, we'll give you a minute, and then maybe Ollie, you can go through the answers that we have.
So as the answers that are trickling in, I'm actually personally interested in seeing, or surprised to see, that most people are using electricity data in their operations. We have roughly 60% that are saying yes, 30% who are saying no. This seems to consolidate. I think we're going to go a little bit deeper afterwards into how this data can be used and should be used. This is maybe the time where we give the floor to our guest. Killian, do you want to jump on board?
Yes, thanks for having me along. So yeah, my name's Killian Daly from Energy Tag. So we're a non-profit working on enabling and advocating more granular, accurate electricity accounting, and obviously very much enjoy collaborating with the folks at Electricity Maps on our work. Just as a bit of background before I get into my slides. So I used to do carbon accounting for a very large company, one of the largest consumers of electricity in the world, French company called Air Liquide. And so I did this across 80 countries and over a load of almost 40 terawatt hours of electricity. So more electricity than Denmark generates in a year. So I have some practical experience about some of the issues we have today with how we track and trace and measure electricity emissions from a practical perspective, and I hope that informs some of the slides I'll be going through in a minute also. So I'm going to talk about some of the regulatory landscape around electricity emissions accounting. First of all, the rules of the game are changing right now. Actually, this is kind of a once in a decade moment where all the major target setting and emissions accounting frameworks for electricity are being updated. Okay, so this is a web of different reporting and accounting frameworks, voluntary and some now becoming mandatory as well on the left. And I think one thing to note is they all kind of stem from or come back to this document called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is the accounting methodology used by 90% of companies globally, about 4,000 terawatt hours, about the same as Europe's electricity consumption. They report using this document. So it's really, really important that this is accurate, right? Because people are setting their net zero targets, deciding how they buy green energy based on this document. That is under review at the moment, and it's also entering into regulations. So the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, when that gets enacted, state level reporting requirements in the US, like California's regulatory requirements, and also through the IFRS standards, which are legally mandated in Turkey, Nigeria, Brazil, and other countries around the world. So we are moving from an age, I would say, of voluntary to regulatory reporting. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol is under review, as I mentioned, a 2-year process. So I'm part of the technical working group that's updating the Scope 2 or electricity emissions guidance. And this topic of granularity is really front and center to that whole discussion, and is one of the leading proposals in the update process. There are already best-in-class examples of regulation that is moving towards more granularity, right? So moving away from annual to hourly accounting, for example. We've seen that in the European Union with the green hydrogen regulations that are, requiring much higher accuracy accounting than the status quo, using instruments like guarantees of origin. And similarly, in the United States, we've seen similar rules for the clean hydrogen tax credit there. So hourly, robust, granular accounting being used to ensure high integrity claims. There's other examples around the world, places like Taiwan, They actually have energy tracking systems that are based fundamentally on 15-minute matching of power rather than the annual averaging we see around the world. So there's a number of really good examples today of best-in-class policy that is already in place and that we can build on to kind of normalize this type of accounting globally. So just to get into the basics of what we're trying to get at here, I know Olivier already touched on some of those elements already, but I just want to make it super simple for folks. So the problem we have today when companies do electricity emissions accounting is that we get a really low quality picture of what their emissions really are. We get a fuzzy version of the Mona Lisa you see here on the left, right? And that's because of two key reasons. One of them is time. We do annual matching, which literally means you can take an energy attribute produced at any time of year and use it at any other time of year. So in simple language, we ignore the variability of renewables, for example. You can be solar powered all night long on the books, obviously not in reality, but you can do that in the accounting. Another issue we have is that we take really large geographical boundaries, right? So in Europe, you could be 100% powered by Icelandic hydro here where I'm sitting in Brussels. Iceland has never exported any electricity anywhere, but the accounting systems pretend that it can. And so we have some issues with the time and spatial granularity of electricity accounting today that kind of need to be addressed if we're going to have accurate emissions accounting and really accurate and I would say, impactful signals for renewable investment. So how do we get a clearer picture? Well, first of all, we don't reinvent the wheel. Electricity markets do this all the time. If you're buying physical power, then you have to do time matching. You can't buy physical solar energy produced 6 months ago or produced last night, and that's not possible. So power markets already have a lot of the fundamentals that we need to think about to get more accurate and granular accounting. The first of them is time matching. So hourly matching, right? Most power markets in Europe settle at an hourly granularity, meaning if you're saying I'm going to, consume solar energy, fine, if the sun's up, or I'm going to consume wind, absolutely, if it's windy, right? And if it's not, then you have to go and, find something else, right? Maybe build a battery to use that solar energy later on in the evening. So that's point one, is to get this more accurate picture, we need time matching. The second one is about deliverability. And this is obviously where folks like Electricity Maps are doing a great job at kind of tracking the electricity flows around somewhere like Europe, what really flows across borders. And so, what we should have is claims being made within the same power grid, or maybe across borders. So maybe from France to Germany, if we can really prove that the electricity did flow between France and Germany, right? But in Europe, most electricity, over 80% of electricity, is produced and consumed in the same country, and the accounting doesn't address that today. So we need those tighter spatial boundaries as well. I'm just going to double click on these. So why does time matter? So this is a heat map on the left of the hourly fossil-free energy percentage in Germany in 2023. So we see middle of the summer days, right? A lot of green energy, a lot of solar. That's really fantastic. We see in the evenings in summer and in the mornings, not a lot of solar, so there's more fossil fuels on the grid. And like week-long periods in November, right, where we don't have any green energy. There's no wind or sun. There's these famous Dunkelflaute. And so we need to think about where do we get clean energy in those times. So annual accounting, what it assumes is that this whole graph is just one color, right? There's no granularity. There's no accurate picture that we're getting. The hourly accounting captures these realities that I've just explained. So it ensures more accurate claims and accounting, and importantly, creates more incentives to make sure that we're cleaning up the hardest hours of the year. So rather than using a solar energy credit from the summertime in those weeks in November, well, we think about how do we get clean energy from something maybe like long duration energy storage. So it's sending more accurate signals and creating this more accurate picture. And the other aspect is obviously on deliverability. Today, I'll just go to the European example, but this is also similar in the US and around the world. energy certificates, RECs, EACs, guarantees of origin, we call them in Europe, they don't really respect the limits of the grid, right? Certificates can flow where power cannot, and that is a problem with today's accounting. It hampers credibility and the effectiveness of green energy markets. The graphic here on the left, what it basically shows is the flows of guarantees of origin in navy and real electricity in green. And we see some large disparities. Germany, for example, imported about 70 terawatt hours, 70 units of electricity in 2023. Meanwhile, 190 of green certificates. So there's way more green energy flowing on the books into Germany than there is actually in reality. And that obviously diminishes real signals for green energy in Germany. So again, if we start to control some of these cross-border flows, make them more accurate, we'll have a better representation of clean energy availability in reality, right? A more accurate clean energy signal. And then finally, this is just a kind of a simple graphic to sum up, I think, why accounting matters. Accounting sets the incentives. It's actually accounting that is the basis of markets, right? Of clean energy markets. And so we need incentives that are covering demand with clean electricity, not just when it's sunny and sunny or windy, but also in these little green dots here. It's called new GC supply. That basically means that we're sourcing clean electricity on an hourly basis in times when there's not enough variable renewables. So we're filling it in with these other technologies. And that's something that is not the case today with today's accounting systems or today's clean energy markets. So that's why we need to move towards granularity. Fundamentally, this is about better financing mechanisms that accelerate the energy transition. And then I think we have a poll. I think I'm running this one. Let me know if I'm not. So the second poll is about granularity. So what granularity are you currently using to report your electricity emissions? We'd be very interested in hearing from you all. Okay, I see the votes are coming in thick and fast. Good to see actually a fair amount of people already doing hourly. I guess I hope I've convinced people that's what ideally we should be moving towards and should be doing eventually. But yeah, it's not common practice today. Most people are doing yearly reporting, which is reflected in this poll. Obviously, some who are not reporting electricity emissions, given the nature of their organizations or whatever. But yeah, it's interesting, and hopefully we can maybe come back in a couple of years after the greenhouse gas protocol is finished, and this graph will be inverted, and we'll see far more folks doing that more accurate hourly accounting. But that's already giving us a good picture. I don't know if Claire or Olivia has any comments on these. If not, I'll pass back.
Yeah, we were discussing actually in preparation for this webinar how many, what portion of folks would be using hourly, and I think that's more than I would have anticipated, given how early on the stage. We wouldn't be here doing a webinar on hourly accounting if that was already the case fully. So very curious, maybe after also in the Q&A to have a discussion about how we can empower more folks to actually jump to the hourly level. Maybe I'll take over from here and talk a little bit more about the feasibility and how we actually are going about executing on doing hourly accounting. And I want to talk specifically about what signals to use for granular grid data. So again, the reminder, there's 3 pieces you need to get together if you want to achieve hourly granular accounting. We're going to double click on the granular grid data piece. And within this, there's basically 2 classes of signals that can be used. They're called average and marginal. And sometimes this comes up, so I think it's important to clarify a little bit here in this space what each have the merit for and what they can be used for. So when you are doing accounting on the average side of things, the average signals are looking at all the electricity that's available to the grid and telling a consumer that uses electricity from that particular grid at that particular moment that their electricity comes from a mix of all the power plants, unless, of course, they procure the electricity from a particular one within the limits that Killian described before, namely deliverability and time matching. So that is why we call them average. We put them under quotation marks because sometimes there's a misunderstanding that average means an average over, for example, a year, which is not the case. It's also not an average over a large region, such as Europe or the US. We want to be as granular as possible here, but it is still an average over all of the power plants on that particular grid at that particular moment. And what you're seeing on the graph here is called a merit order curve. What we're doing is that for a particular grid on a particular market, we're looking at all the types of power plants that are bidding into the system at a particular time. And then we're ranking them from the cheapest to the most expensive, because that is typically how power plants are dispatched on an electricity grid. And then we're calling the last power plant, which in theory has spare capacity, we're calling that the marginal one. And so there's also an alternative that is often brought up in these conversations, which is called marginal signals. And there's been a debate whether or not that can be used for accounting purposes. And I just wanted to remind folks here that for the particular usage of Scope 2 carbon accounting, marginal signals from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol in their guidance are stipulating that you cannot use them. Actually, I think we have a slide here. This is a direct quote from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol saying companies shall not use marginal emission factors for location-based Scope 2 calculation. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol has actually another guidance for the use of marginal emission factors. We're not going to dive into that in this particular session. And maybe to just touch a few words about why marginal isn't valid for location-based Scope 2 calculations is basically because if you look at the merit order curve here, you need to be able to assign a footprint to every consumer on the grid. And if every consumer on the grid ends up only being assigned the marginal power plant, then there are folks on the grid or power plants on the grid that hasn't been associated emissions to a consumer. And that means that we can end up in tricky situations with, for example, a consumer having avoided more emissions than have been physically emitted on the grid. And this is purely because the marginal signal is only directed towards one particular power plant, but we need to account for all emissions on the grid, and hence why these average signals are the de facto choice for this type of accounting. So if you actually want the most precise signal here that fits the build that Killian talked about before, meaning hourly matching and deliverability, flow tracing is the methodology right now that most accurately attributes emissions across borders. So let me take an example. In the location where I'm currently based, Denmark, it's not uncommon to have more than 30% of electricity being imported from neighboring countries. And it's very often that we have a little bit of nuclear actually electricity here in Denmark, even though Denmark doesn't have nuclear power plants. It's imported through southern Sweden, but it also turns out that the nuclear power plants are not directly in that neighboring region. You need to go like one region more away. So the point is you need to look at the whole interconnectivity of the grid in order to understand where electricity comes from. And so it's not uncommon that in Denmark, statistically speaking, we have a little bit of Spanish and French electricity that finds its way to Denmark through all the interconnected systems. And if we don't take into account all of this interconnectedness, we can have errors on the emissions that typically range in the 10 to 15% range. And you can even have an error which is of the order of magnitude of 2x, so quite large. And we've written about the topic. It's a peer-reviewed methodology that actually preceded the existence of electricity maps. Lots of academics have worked on this, and it's quite solid. So if you want to take an accurate view of emissions, flow tracing is absolutely critical. And down the line, we hope that can even serve as a definition of deliverability that Killian mentioned before, to make sure we're setting the right incentives, that the right interconnectors are getting built in order to reduce the emissions of the power system. Talk a little bit about what is important to keep in mind when we're looking at the processing of the data sources there. So at Electricity Maps, we're now collecting data from more than 100 plus data sources. We're collecting data from the data providers directly, looking at how much wind was produced in a particular country or a particular bidding zone for a particular hour. looking at all the different power production sources, but also all the flows of electricity across borders and soon also inside different countries. And all of this is processed because we need to have a very, very strict quality control on what comes in. Often we can't trust the data that comes in from a data provider if there's either a delay in the data, or if there's a missing data point, or if there's part of, for example, the wind generation which is underreported. So we have AI systems represented a little bit by this chip in the middle, this brain, which analyzes historical patterns to figure out, can we actually trust this data point? And if this data point can't be trusted, with systems that come in and generate the missing data, fill in the gaps, if you will, in these time series, to make sure that down the line, we always have the most accurate emissions data. And, sneak peek, we do have a white paper coming out pretty soon that is looking at comparing electricity maps data with other authoritative data sources on different timescales in order to verify how accurate the emissions data we have is. So stay tuned for that as well. Finally, we recently also announced global coverage, or almost global coverage. So you see, this is a representation of the map that we have on electricity maps. Every color represents the carbon intensity of the grid. Greener colors represent cleaner grids, and gray colors represent areas for which we do not have data. And you'll see we've been able to cover now a significant amount of the world, which means, quite bluntly, there's little excuses to say, there's lacking data for particular regions, and that is prohibiting us from doing our hourly accounting. Well, we now have electricity data available, so feel free to reach out for us in case you're interested in using it. A little bit of inspiration going beyond the particular use case of Scope 2 carbon accounting. We at Electricity Map have a strong belief that this hourly data can unlock a lot of value, and there's different places where this is unlocking value. One example is in carbon-aware computing. This is an example with Google, but there's quite a lot of the open source world which is creating new projects that are able to shift the time at which electricity is consumed. So what Google is doing there is that they're using forecasts from electricity maps, telling them when is the grid going to be the cleanest in the next day, and in which location is it going to be the cleanest. And then their data centers are shifting the time at which they're running heavy AI computations in order to match the times and the locations where the grid is the cleanest. And so, for example, if the wind is starting to blow in Denmark, but it isn't blowing that much in Ireland, then might be shifting a compute job from Dublin, for example, to the Copenhagen area in order to reduce the carbon footprint. So that is one exciting use case that I think we're going to see much more of, especially as the footprint of AI is growing and as we're seeing the electricity consumption needs of AI increasing. Another use case is with Cisco. We know that networking equipments are a significant part as well of the carbon footprint of the digital infrastructure. And you see in the Cisco Nexus dashboard, this offers customers visibility into where the footprints are the highest and where the biggest optimizations lie ahead. And this is also something that I'm quite excited about, and I think we're going to see much more of this happening in the future. And finally, going more into some consumer spaces, this is an example with Samsung, which has an app that is connected to dishwashers or washing machines at home. And what is interesting is that they're starting to show to their consumers at home where the electricity powering these devices is coming from and when is the optimal time to run these devices. And soon we'll see these devices run automatically at the optimal time. I'll come home, start my dishwasher, and then it will have a whole night in order to figure out when is the optimal time to run. And it will pick the time during the night where the electricity is the cleanest, and down the line the cheapest as well, in order to save cost for a consumer. And if you think about devices that you might own that have this flexibility with dishwashers, washing machines, but obviously also electric vehicles, and this is also an example that we're doing with Manta. And the only thing I'll highlight here is the interesting piece in the middle, where as a consumer, you can express your preferences by either saying, I want to optimize for saving money, I want to optimize for maximizing the amount of renewables I'm using, or I want to minimize my carbon footprint. And so you keep control as a user, whether or not you want to optimize for one thing or the other. So this concludes a little bit this webinar. I think there's lots of exciting avenues in which this hourly information can start shifting fundamentally the way we do business or the way we are living our lives. But now we'll be very happy to take any questions, and I think Leah will be the person who will run through the questions and sort about. But feel free to ask them in the chat in the meantime.
Yes, exactly. We already have a bunch of interesting questions, so feel free to go in there and upvote the questions that you want an answer to, and also pose new ones. But I'll already get started. Somebody asked, how does the practice of emissions accounting for electricity evolve from the yearly approach to the 24/7 approach, when the marketplace, for example, suppliers and consumers, will require time to adapt and provide or obtain access to granular data? And I think it might be interesting for both of you to give your viewpoint, but maybe Olivier, you want to start?
Yes, so I can maybe say that we are living in a world where I've seen for the past couple of years the industry start adapting faster than I would have originally anticipated. I think Killian can probably give more color into some of the examples that are coming up where offerings are starting to appear. But for example, things such as contracting PPAs, we are now starting to see PPAs structured in a way that it's delivering directly baseload 24/7. It is, I would say, still in the early days where we're seeing this accelerating more and more. And I'm curious to hear like a little bit from your perspective, Killian, what you're seeing on that particular side of things.
Yeah, I think, it's a great question and a fair one. Obviously, any time I guess we change a standard or raise the bar with anything, especially if it's like through a global standard, there's, first of all, you have to raise the bar so that people start to do this hourly accounting, to do this granular accounting en masse, I would say. As you mentioned, Olivier, there's already people doing this today, right? Voluntarily, whether that's large companies who are doing it across their global operations, like Google are already reporting their hourly matching scores, I think, on all their data centers around the world. There's also, suppliers like in the UK working with startup companies like Octopus Energy, Good Energy, who are offering this to thousands of customers. So the suppliers can actually take a lot of this complexity or perceived complexity out of the equation, right? So yeah, you can check our website. We have about 35 different case studies of people doing this right now today. So it's absolutely feasible. And I think, for it to be, let's say, the new global norm, like anything, right? You raise the bar and then give a bit of time for the ecosystem to adapt. And I guess finally, I think one thing that's really important to mention is that we're not really asking something that is not that is reinventing the wheel, right? If companies are paying for electricity, especially larger ones, like they're already on a time of use tariff, most likely, or paying for electricity on an hourly basis through electricity markets. So they have their hourly consumption data, like wind turbines, solar panels at a utility level. They have generation data at way higher than hourly granularity, sometimes even every 10 seconds, every 1 second from their SCADA system. So the data is there. It's just about making that more easily accessible because it's already been used for other purposes. For example, billing electricity.
Thanks for your take on that. Another person wants to get your take on the following question. Granular matching of market-based, I think they probably mean annual matching of market-based plus granular location-based accounting. So together, like a blended accounting approach without the need to distinguish market-based and location-based accounting. True or false? What is your take on this? Maybe, Killian, you want to get started on that one?
Yeah, I see, I do think that more granular accounting is kind of like addressing some of the credibility issues that are already addressed, like the deliverability boundaries that are already addressed in location-based. But I do think that they are fundamentally different things still, right? Like location-based accounting is taking the whole load of generators on the grid you're on and kind of slicing that out depending on how much you're consuming electricity. So that gives one piece of really valuable information. but it doesn't look at the contracts that you've signed, right, and how you're contracting power. And I think that's where the market-based method comes in. So, even with time and location matching, I think, yeah, those things probably come closer together, but I think they are still different, and both give different useful information. So I don't think we can quite go as far as saying, now that we're doing granular market-based accounting, we can just talk about one type of electricity accounting. There's always going to be the grid average stuff and the contract stuff, and I think they'll probably, I think they should remain separate. But
yeah, maybe if I might add, what I've observed over time is that one way to think about this is that we can see market-based as a very efficient financing instrument, but sort of on the traceability side of things, when we've had statements such as, because I'm buying a guarantee of origin with solar, I'm powered by solar electricity at night. This is where the credibility of that claim typically broke down because of the lack of physical representativeness of the particular piece. And this is where location-based was shining much more. It is in a very effective way of speaking in an intuitive way about where your electricity comes from, but it doesn't allow you at all to use any financial instruments. And I think we're getting a good compromise with granular accounting, where we're having both a credible traceability instrument where the physical reality shines through, and yet are keeping some of the agency and the potential to finance the transition forward. So I do think this hybrid, which is asked in the question, is, in my opinion, actually pretty well reflected in this granular accounting, which is trying to take the best of both worlds with a minimum of drawbacks.
Cool. Thanks for sharing. And some more people want to know, when using 24/7 accounting, how does one account for behind the meter generation? So, for example, rooftop solar power. I think interesting question. So they say, for example, if I generate solar energy during the day, but only consume a portion and a portion is sent to the grid, how do I get hourly credit for the solar energy I generated?
Do you want to go there, Killian, or should I?
Yeah, well, the way, if you have on-site solar generation, let's say on top of your factory, then there's a direct physical link, right? So let's say in the middle of the day, just to take an example, you consume 10 units of electricity, the solar panels are producing 15. So you take 10 of those, and in the hour, you're zero emissions, you're completely solar powered, and 5 are exported to the grid. Well, that you could sell the hourly certificates or have those maybe under some sort of other electricity contract, but you wouldn't be able to then claim to use them at night, for example, right? Like that's the whole purpose of this type of accounting. You can't bank those and make up for, grid imports 6 or 7 hours later, because that would kind of degrade the whole accuracy of the accounting. But absolutely, just to be clear, you can still benefit from on-site solar during the hour in which it's produced.
Do you want to add something to that, Olivier, or?
No, I think Killian is the accounting expert here. I don't think I have anything more clever to add.
We'll go into one more question around 24/7 accounting. Somebody wants to know, do the speakers have a viewpoint on whether a company pursuing 24/7 should be able to claim what already exists on the grid at the expense of the company bringing more demand to the market by having to purchase generation that is 100% incremental to what already exists?
Maybe I can start on this one. So I do think that what's important is that we are communicating very clearly what 24/7 means and what an associated claim actually is. And so if I'm having a facility in, let's say, if I live in a country that is already like almost completely clean from an energy perspective, such as Norway, for example, then I believe that there is value in being able to claim already without any additional purchases that we are that company or that facility is powered by clean electricity. And the reason is that we're sending a pretty strong signal towards the policymakers of saying we do want to continue having electricity consumption or facilities in locations that are funding either the maintenance or the installation of these new systems, even though we didn't directly procure them. And so I think that if we don't do that, then we are not sending a signal to policymakers to saying, you know what, we want countries with either hydro, nuclear, or wind, because right now some of the let's say renewable some of the non-wind and solar technologies that are still providing clean energy are difficult to fund through guarantees of origin and renewable energy credits, and these should not be left outside on the curb, I would say.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's, there is maybe one case where I think having this very stringent incrementality is something that we've publicly advocated for. It's when, for example, when there's going to be state support or tax incentives given to the build out of large new electrolyzers or very electro-intensive industries, where it's very important that that's clean electricity, and so you're adding new demand and having more stringent requirements on adding new load new supply rather is also very important. I do think as well, even in general accounting, there could be some need to have guardrails around a given company, even if it's time and location matched, just sourcing all of their power from a 50-year-old hydro plant, for example, and that company having the same zero emissions as someone who's gone out and done something additional. So I think there's some nuance also in the cases of existing demand.
Thank you. We'll dive into some questions that are a little more related to the different signals, or in this case specifically to flow tracing. So somebody's wondering, how does or does not flow tracing support residual mix calculations? And I think, Olivier, you will probably be the right person to answer that one.
Yeah, we're getting deep into technical questions. I love it. So first thing is, we did publish a paper that touches a little bit on residual mix and how one could calculate residual mix with granular accounting. You can find it on our website. The second piece is, there is a possibility to use flow tracing in order to restrict the deliverable, or to define deliverability, and therefore define what is the eligibility of a certificate. So let me take one example. If we, for example, see that a country like Norway is exporting a certain amount or a certain percentage of their electricity to a neighboring country, then re-exporting a certain percentage to a second country after that, flow tracing enables us to know how much of the Norwegian electricity actually ends up in this second order neighbor. And this computation could be applied to certificates as well, which could tell us how many of these certificates issued in Norway can actually be claimed, canceled in the country of destination. So, I wish I had a whiteboard to draw it out. It would probably be simpler, but I hope that answer sort of gives an idea of how flow tracing could be used in order to define the deliverability criteria, of RACs or GEOs down the line.
Thank you, Olivier. Another question specifically to you, I guess, or to Electricity Maps. Does Electricity Maps report actual data only, or also do forecasting? Or do others do forecasting on top of Electricity Maps data?
So we do actually forecast global, like all of the data that you see on Electricity Maps in real time. We're also forecasting it a couple of days ahead now in order to power some of the use cases that I described at the end of the presentation, such as smart electric vehicle charging or carbon-aware computing, where the load on data centers is shifted to align with times where the carbon intensity is the lowest. This gives me the opportunity just to deep dive a little bit about why this is a really important and complicated issue. If you actually want to forecast how clean the electricity is going to be in the next couple of hours, you need to forecast all of the electricity generation on the whole electricity grid and all of the electricity flows on all of the links of the grid, because down the line, generated electricity through flow tracing can find its way to many different places on the grid. And so if we have the slightest error in the forecast in one particular location, that might actually affect the deliverability of electricity on all the other locations. And hence why we spent quite a bit of time building a whole forecasting engine that you can also read more of in our blog. We recently published two blog posts on how we're doing forecasting. So if you're interested in forecasting data, feel free to reach out to us and we'll have a chat.
Okay, perfect. I think we'll maybe go through one last question. A lot of people want to know, and I think quite understandable in current times, what challenges or also opportunities are you facing in the US in the light of the new administration's perspective on renewables and carbon? So I think that might be interesting to both of you. Olivier, maybe you want to start while you're talking.
Yeah, so maybe I'll take a very specific example to how Electricity Map were exposed to some of the risks. In order to build like our forecasting system, we do rely on some weather providers, for example, that are based in the US. So there's definitely an impact there, and we're making sure that our data feeds are not going down based on this. There's also data sources that are coming directly from the EIA and the EPA that represent the raw generation data we're getting from the US, but also some of the power plant specific emission factors that we're using. So a lot of the input data that goes to the big brain that I showed before are coming from these locations. Luckily enough, we do have all these AI models that are trained on historical data. That means that if the data feed goes down, we can still continue to operate. And this is just a very stark example that showcases that in the world we're living today, we need to build robust data systems that can handle data outages, because one thing is certain, and it is that the world is uncertain. So we need to be ready for change. Killian, maybe you have a slightly more policy-related perspective to add to what I just said.
Obviously, it's a complicated, it's a complicated situation. I think from the policy perspective, we have someone based full time in the US working on policy. There's a lot of things to do with the energy transition that are under direct threat. Let's be clear about that. On the other hand, I think we've seen that with things like the Inflation Reduction Act. I think there is quite a lot of support also from Republicans in Congress for maintaining a lot of those tax credits, because it's bringing money and jobs to their constituencies, right? So I think it mightn't be as bad as the worst case scenario, and we may see things maintained for renewables or clean hydrogen tax credits. The clean hydrogen tax credit I mentioned already. There's been quite a lot of support from the industry to maintain that from a broad spectrum of companies. So I think it's not actually worst case scenario stuff. I think just more generally on, let's say, round the clock renewable power, I think there's certain elements. So 90% of capacity built in the US this year is going to be either solar, wind, or gas. Or batteries. So gas is going to play a pretty small role there. And the economics of solar and storage in particular are directly challenging gas. So I think economics is also and is always going to be a very, very important thing everywhere, and particularly in the US. So I think there's just some resiliency in the system, basically. If you want new electricity capacity, well, looking to gas that takes 5 or 6 years and is 3 times more expensive than it was before COVID, well, it's just not a very smart way to look at things. So I think, there's some momentum that can hopefully get us through these tough few years.
Great, thank you. And maybe to end it also on a positive note and a little bit of an outlook as well. Somebody wants to know what other signals besides carbon intensity or carbon-free energy percentage, which I think were mostly mentioned throughout, do you foresee as crucial to allow companies and consumers contribute to decarbonizing the grid?
Yeah, I think Killian actually gave us already a piece of the answer, and it's the economics part of things, right? I mean, I think the economics are not going away. I'm taking a bit of a shortcut, but wind and solar, when they're able to produce electricity, are the cheapest source of electricity. So we are going to see, volatility on the markets is not going away anytime soon. And so being able to have the electricity prices forecasted alongside the carbon piece, we are going to see, I think, an increased alignment between those two signals. And therefore, I mean, the reason why we, believe so strongly in this granular accounting as well is to be able to align sort of your operational expenses with your sustainability objectives. And that's also why the electricity maps, we are going towards a direction where we will be forecasting electricity prices and making them available as part of this platform. Because obviously, if you can tell a story to your consumers, your customers, your leadership, to say, look, we're going to keep our sustainability objectives and we're going to reduce costs at the same time. I mean, what's not to like, right? So I think economics are going to win it all ultimately. If we can showcase that there's alignment between both, then perfect. We have the best of both worlds.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. The heat map that I showed earlier of carbon intensity on the grid in Germany, if you look at the same map for prices, they look quite similar, right? And so I think it's just kind of naive to bet your long-term sourcing strategy of electricity on in Europe, for example, or in anywhere in the world where gas is expensive and volatile, which is most places, on gas being cheap and on there not being volatility in electricity markets. So the more you can, for example, hedge your power using renewables and flexibility assets as around the clock as possible, and that just continues to get more and more around the clock every day, so every year, I think this is better for planet, but also for your pocket, right? And when those two things start to align more and more, I think it's basically inevitable, right? It's very hard to push back against. So yeah, very much aligned there. To have this world of emissions and pricing come closer together is something really encouraging, and I think we need to continue to spread that message.
Totally agree. Thank you, Killian, and thank you, Olivier. And yeah, that brings us to the end of this webinar. There's still a bunch of questions in the questions tab, and we'll make sure to follow up with you on those and get back to you. But for now, that's it for today. I'm gonna pop some links into the links tab. So if you want to get API access, you can do so via our website or contact us if you have more questions. And we also have a data portal where you can download free data sets in CSV files for historical grid data to get you started on the first steps to more granular accounting practices, maybe, and granular reporting. And yes, otherwise, well, it was very great to have you here. Thank you, Olivier and Killian, for joining today. I hope everyone learned something new and yeah, feels good about where this is going. And yeah, we'll send you the recording of this webinar soon. So have a great evening or a great day, depending on where you're located. And thank you for joining.
Thank you all. And thanks, Killian, for joining. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for having me. All the best. Bye.